this morning. He's going to be doing our lesson. Aaron is Chris and I's second oldest. Most of you know Aaron. He's been here a couple of times. I helped out with the Devo on the Tuesday night, Thanksgiving. Thanks to Chris asking to do it as well. But he graciously offered to take the opportunity to speak to us this morning. I asked if you'd write down a bit of a bio because I always mess this part up. So and I would have, because this is different than what I would have said. So he lives in Castle Rock, Colorado, with his beautiful wife Jacqueline. Graduated from the Bear Valley Bible Institute in 2018. After which he took the position of an associate minister with a church family in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. At the beginning of this year, however, he and Jacqueline moved back up to the Colorado in order to make a transition to a more full-time position with the Daily Apologist. So Aaron's going to bring our lesson this morning. We're grateful to have him here for a couple of weeks with us, but certainly we're just glad that we can share him with you all this morning. Aaron, thanks.
Well, good morning, everyone. It is wonderful to be back here with you. Before I get started, I just want to make sure I have my equipment. I don't know where the clicker is to advance. Is it on this one here? Just up, down. Perfect. I'm assuming it's this one. Well, good morning, everyone. Certainly want to thank Chris and Jeff and the elders for giving me this opportunity. It is always a privilege to be able to come down here, visit with family, but also to speak, and it is so encouraging each time that my wife and I are able to come up here. Someone once said that to understand one of Jesus' parables is to be changed by one of Jesus' parables. That is, if you truly understand what the parable is saying, you cannot help but be changed by it. And I found this to be true personally. And I would like to share with you my small amount of understanding of one particular parable in the hopes that it might also change a small part of your life. This parable will come from Luke chapter 7, starting in verse 36. And if you have your Bibles, I would encourage you to turn there so that you can follow along with me and be looking at it as I'm teaching, because that's where we're going to be spending all of our time this morning. Luke chapter 7, starting in verse 36. This is the parable of Simon the Pharisee inviting Jesus to his home, and then you had the sinful woman come and wash his feet. That's the parable that we have in mind, and I'm just going to go ahead and start reading there in Luke 7, verse 36. One of the Pharisees asked him, that is Jesus, to eat with him. And he, Jesus, went into the Pharisee's house and reclined at table. And behold, a woman of the city, who was a sinner, when she learned that he was reclining at table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of ointment. And standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears, and wipe them with the hair of her head, and kiss his feet, and anointed them with the ointment. Now, when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who's touching him, for she is a sinner. What I'd like to do first is just try to unpack Simon's distorted view of the situation. Now, the first and most obvious distortion of Simon's view is that he can only see this woman in terms of her sin. He cannot see her in terms of her humanity, just her sin. And then the other, I think, implied distortion is that he sees himself as righteous. Think, would Simon have allowed this woman to wash his feet or to even touch him, to approach him? Obviously not. Why? Well, because he's righteous, right? He's way up here. She's way down there. So he can't see the woman for who she is, just in terms of her sin. He sees himself in terms of his righteousness. And then the third distortion is that the two don't mix. The righteous do not associate with the sinful. But I don't want to stop there, just with the surface level distortion. I want to see, why is it that this distortion arose in the first place? How is it that Simon got to where he was in his own thinking and ideology? As best I can tell, Simon's thinking is along these lines. Firstly, we belong to two separate groups, right? This woman and me, we belong to two separate groups. Second, the reason that I know that we belong to these two different groups is all the stuff that you've done and all the stuff that I've done, right? You've done all of this nasty stuff over here, I've done all this good stuff over here, and that's how I know that we belong to these two different groups. And then, because we occupy those two different groups, I should treat you in a certain way and you should treat me in a certain way. So that seems to be the framework that Simon is operating with. And as I was working through this, I could not help but notice the similarity between what Simon seems to be thinking and what many of us in our society also seem to be thinking. Right? Doesn't it sound at least a little bit familiar? We're in these two different groups because of these things that we do or think or say, and because we are in those two different groups, this is how we ought to treat each other? Doesn't sound too far off from what's happening right now. So let's just explore this framework together. Firstly, when it comes to dividing people up into various groups, it's not as though there are only a select few options to choose from, right? People can be divided into any number of groups. I belong to a whole host of different groups that I could be divided up along, and so do you. So why is it that Simon is just selecting two specific groups here, right? Who decides what relevance each groups have? Who decided how significant the group was? Now, Simon has decided to divide people along the lines of righteous and sinner. And so, that's at least a biblical framework. So we're off to a good start there, okay? So righteous and sinner. But secondly, who decides what constitutes those differences? So after you have divided people up into the different groups, who draws the parameters around those groups? Who decides what counts as membership? Think of this from Simon's perspective. He's a Pharisee. So from Simon's perspective, what makes someone either righteous or a sinner? Healing on the Sabbath? Sinner. Breaking the command to honor your parents in order to keep the tradition of Korban? Righteous. Not washing your hands before every meal? Makes you a sinner. Putting big amounts of money into the treasury? Oh, that's what righteous people do. And so, from Simon's perspective, the categories themselves may be legitimate, but the parameters around those categories may be illegitimate. But then, thirdly, who decides how the relevant groups ought to interact with each other? Who decides how the relevant groups ought to interact with each other? Right, so was it God that decided that sinful people should not associate with righteous people and vice versa? I think obviously not. The culture moved in this direction, no doubt motivated by wanting to do what God had said, but hopelessly misunderstanding it. And then the rest of the people had just adopted this as though it were God's framework. Now, let's just sit there for a moment. Let me throw out some ideas, stimulate our thinking, and then we'll pick them back up near the end. First question. In our society, who decides what the relevant differences are? Right? Who decides what groups people are slotted into, what the most relevant features are? To a large degree, wouldn't that be the media? Doesn't the media pretty much tell us which groups we should care about, which groups we are members of, right? You got white people and then everyone else, right? People of color. We have the racists and the non-racists, or now not just the non-racists, but the anti-racists. We've got Republicans and Democrats. We've got legal and illegal immigrants. We have those that are gay, those that are straight, cisgender, transgender, tolerant, intolerant. Aren't these the relevant groups in our society? So where are they coming from? Who said that those are the relevant groups into which we should sort ourselves and see ourselves through? As Christians, we cannot just allow ourselves to be passively sucked into these dichotomies. Why would we let the people on TV tell us which groups are the most important to think about? Which memberships we ought to care about for our own lives? Now, I'm not even saying that the people on the TV are necessarily wrong, right? They could be 100% correct. Seems unlikely, but it's possible. What I am saying is that we should not be letting the TV set the agenda. They are not reliable guides, such that even if they do get it right, it will only be incidentally. As Christians, we ought to let God set the agenda. Second question: who decides what constitutes membership into these different groups? Who draws the parameters? What constitutes being white or being a person of color? Where are the lines and who's drawing them? Where are the lines demarcating the beginnings and ends of racism? Who decides what a true Republican or Democrat looks like? Who gets to draw the line between legal and illegal immigrant? Who decides what a gay or straight person looks like? Who draws the lines around gender? Just think about it. Suppose a girl likes to play sports, hangs out with boys, has no interest in wearing dresses or playing with dolls. Is this an indication that she is really a boy? Some in our culture would say yes. But who's drawing those lines? Who decides what an intolerant person looks like, or a tolerant one? In each case, there's good reason to think that, again, those in the media, those in the classroom, the universities, those are the ones who are drawing these lines around these groups. And again, I'm not saying that they're necessarily wrong. In some cases, it may be perfectly appropriate. But in others, it may be seriously distorting what God has to say on the topic. And it's our job to be able to see those through the light of Scripture. Finally, number 3, who decides how the relevant groups ought to treat each other? Who makes those rules? What's the proper way for white people to treat people of color and vice versa? How ought we to treat those who are racist? What is the appropriate attitude that a Republican should have toward a Democrat, and vice versa? How ought we to treat illegal immigrants? How ought we to treat trans and gay people? Can you begin to see how dangerous it becomes if we let our society make these rules, tell us which groups we belong to, which ones we should care about, draws the parameters around those groups, and then tells us how we should behave toward each other? Begin to see how dangerous and destructive and divisive this can become. And I need to preemptively warn against something here. The temptation is for us to say, oh, well, I'm a Christian. I read my Bible every day. Of course I wouldn't be letting the culture, set the agenda. Of course I wouldn't be letting the culture distort my view of what God has had to say on this topic. At least that's my knee-jerk reaction. But are you so sure? Who do you suppose read their Bible more? Simon the Pharisee or you? I'm thinking, at least for my own self, Simon probably read his Bible more than me. And how hard was it for Simon to see past the framework that his culture had constructed? Extremely difficult. So why is it that we would think that it would be that much easier for us? In this story, we typically want to identify ourselves with the woman that we'll be talking about more in just a moment. But realistically, when you do a one-to-one comparison, how well does your life match up with this woman? maybe not really at all. But how well would your life match up with Simon the Pharisee? You're at the building every time the doors are open, right? You read your Bible, you know, all of these kinds of things. If you've been in the church for any number of years, you're probably more likely to identify with Simon than with the woman. Having laid out Simon's distorted view then, let's have a look and see how Jesus attempts to correct this. So, starting in verse 40, we see, "And Jesus answered and said to him, 'Simon, I have something to say to you.' And he said, 'Say it, teacher.' A certain moneylender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now, which of them will love him more?' Simon answered, 'The one, I suppose, for whom he canceled the larger debt.' And he said to him, 'You have judged rightly.'" Okay. When I started studying this parable threw me for a loop. It didn't really connect with me. And here's why. What is Simon's fundamental problem? It seems like Simon's fundamental problem is that he's broken the world up into these groups, put these arbitrary lines around them, and then created these rules for the two groups to interact with each other. In other words, it kind of seems like Simon's main problem is that he's kind of a judgmental jerk, if I were to summarize it. So there's Simon's problem. Question: how does Jesus' parable about two guys who owed money solve Simon's problem? How does this parable help Simon to stop being so judgmental? Because it's not immediately obvious to me. I would have expected something like, "Simon, I have something to tell you. There were two people who had something in their eye. One had a speck, the other had a log." Right? Like, that's somewhat what I would have expected. That's not what we get. We get two guys who owed money and are both forgiven. Well, let's try to identify the elements of the parable and see if we can start putting the pieces together. So the most obvious one, who is the greater debtor? I think that one, obviously the woman, okay? So the woman is the greater debtor. I mean, look at the love that this woman is showing to Jesus, right? Coming in, washing his feet, crying at breaking the ointment on his feet, right? So the woman is loving Jesus a lot, so that would identify her with the larger debtor. So even just given the parable so far, what does this imply about the woman's sins? That they've been forgiven, right? The person that's been forgiven much loves much. This woman is loving much, therefore she's been forgiven much. So in point of fact, Simon is actually wrong about this woman. She's not a sinner. She's been forgiven. But if the woman is the greater debtor, who's Simon? Wouldn't he be the lesser debtor? So if Simon is the lesser debtor, what does that imply about Simon's love? That it's also lesser. In fact, Jesus seems to make this very point in the following verses. Pick up in verse 44. Then, turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. You didn't anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore, I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But he who is forgiven little loves little." Here's my question. Does this sound like Jesus is making a positive or negative assessment of Simon the Pharisee? It seems negative. Seems almost maybe like a little bit of an indictment against Simon. Like maybe Simon should have washed Jesus' feet when he came in. Like maybe Simon should have greeted Jesus with a kiss. That maybe Simon ought to have a little more love. Okay? So if Simon ought to have a little more love, what does that imply about the size of his debt? That maybe it's a little bit greater than he thinks it is. Kyle Snodgrass, funny last name, but he wrote a book on the parables. He observes that, quote, Simon has shown no evidence of love. Has he been forgiven at all? Or, to stay with the thought of the proverb, is the one who loves not at all forgiven not at all? The narrative is left open. And surely, Jesus' words were intended as a challenge to Simon to reconsider both his own stance, maybe he's not so small a debtor, and his attitudes toward both the woman and Jesus. Howard Marshall concludes the following, quote, the saying ultimately asks those who have little love for Jesus whether they have realized the magnitude of their sin and their need for forgiveness, end quote. In other words, Simon's wrong about the woman. She's not a sinner, she's forgiven. But he also seems to be wrong about himself. He's the sinner. He is the one that is unforgiven. And if this is the case, what does Simon's rule about how righteous people ought to interact with sinful people imply about Jesus attending this dinner? Who invited Jesus to dinner? Simon. Who's the sinner? Simon. So what should Jesus have done on Simon's framework? No thanks, Simon. I don't associate with sinful people. And yet, here Jesus is, sharing a meal with Simon the sinner. Why? Because Jesus came to seek and save the lost. That's why. Because Jesus sees past the sin, and Jesus sees the person who is lost in need of saving. And the only way to save lost people is to be among them. Therefore, associating with sinners, horror of all horrors, from Jesus' perspective, is perfectly good. It's encouraged, in fact. Therefore, on all accounts, Simon is dead wrong. So let's look at how these conflicting perspectives, or maybe how a correction of Simon's perspective, has a practical outworking, right? So let's start with Jesus' attitudes toward the woman versus Simon's. When Jesus saw the woman, he welcomed her. When Simon saw the woman, he rejected her. From Jesus' perspective, the woman was seen. From Simon's perspective, she was ignored. Jesus forgave her. Simon condemned her. Jesus showed compassion. Simon was dismissive. So here's my question. Which of these lists best describes your attitudes toward the sinners of our society? In fact, here's a better question. Which of these lists more accurately describes how the sinners of our society feel treated by the church? Think about it. How do trans or gay people feel treated by the church? How do minorities feel toward the church? How do Democrats feel treated by Republican Christians? How do Republicans feel toward Christian Democrats? Do they feel rejected? Ignored? Do they feel condemned? Dismissed? How can we be more like Jesus toward the sinners of our society? Maybe by welcoming them, by seeing them, by not being so condemning, maybe forgiving them, knowing that we ourselves have been forgiven as much. Maybe by showing them compassion. I don't think that it is an exaggeration to say that the church has a PR problem on its hands. The culture at large sees Christians negatively. They are put off by Christians and Christianity. Why? Perhaps it's because we've allowed the culture to frame the issues that the church cares about. That they have decided which differences are relevant, what those differences look like, and how the people in those two different categories should treat each other. And by and large, the church has been playing on their turf, trying to win their game. Jesus was not playing on anyone's turf. He wasn't playing on Simon's turf. He wasn't playing on the woman's turf. He wasn't on Simon's side or the woman's side. He was on his side. What one author has called the transcendent middle ground. Right? Jesus didn't operate on this team or that team. He was on his team. And that's the only question that really matters. It's not, is God on our side? It's, are we on God's side? That transcendent middle ground. We need to start treating people the way Jesus treated people. And that starts by seeing people as people. It's that fundamental. I believe that we can make a lot of progress toward that goal of finding that transcendent middle ground by seriously answering the question that Jesus asked Simon. Do you see this woman? And I'm serious. Think about the sinners of our society. Do you see this woman? Do we see the sinners? Do we see our enemies? Do we see across the aisle? Do we see the untouchables? Do we see people? Because Jesus did. Jesus saw the woman. He saw people. And he sees you. Whether you are the woman sinner or Simon the sinner, Jesus sees you. And if you are the greater debtor, the lesser debtor, if there is such a thing, he's willing to forgive all the same. He's ready and willing to forgive you if you will but accept the pardon. But maybe if you have considered yourself the lesser debtor, and maybe your love for Jesus has reflected that, and you realize that maybe your debt was not so little after all, that maybe Jesus deserves a little bit more love that he hasn't been getting, well, we can begin to make progress on that front too. Jesus was there at Simon's table. Simon wasn't a lost cause. You certainly are not a lost cause either. I'm not a lost cause. I'm banking on the fact that I'm not a lost cause. Either way, if you're a debtor, one who loves little, Jesus sees you, and he's willing to help you, to save you, to forgive you. Would you make that right with him today, right now?